Welcome to our presentation on the boomerang effect, content that keeps kids coming back. So who will be taking you on this journey today? Well, it'll be myself, Maxine Fox, and I am Managing Director at Giraffe Insights. I lead a dedicated team that have worked very closely with myself and also Fiona and ITV on this exciting research study.
Hi, I'm Fiona Lennon from ITV. I'm head of audiences for lots of different genres, including children. So I work at ITV, as I said. We have lots of different output of our content, appealing to all audiences across the UK, including family content and including children's content. And this is where this project came about, was to appeal to children.
And I head up Giraffe Insights, and as I say, we worked closely on this project with Fiona and the rest of the ITV team, and we are kids, youth and family specialists when it comes to research and insight. So there are two strands to our business. The first is that we conduct bespoke research to meet individual client needs, just like this study that we're sharing with you today. And that's both in the UK and across international markets as well, using lots of different approaches. But we also run our own flagship studies in-house. And these studies were really born out of the fact that we kept on being asked the same questions time and time again. And so we wanted to really give back to the industry and provide data where there were gaps. And one of those studies is called Kids in the Screen Changing the Channel, which has actually been incorporated into this research piece. So in terms of what we will cover in today's session, so we're going to look at the content that kids love. So what is it about certain types of content that makes kids go to those shows? But also importantly, what is it that actually keeps them coming back time and time again? And then we'll then end on looking actually what this means for the likes of ITV when thinking about content that we know kids love. So in terms of this study in its entirety, we used a number of different approaches. There was lots of different objectives. The first was to use our proprietary research, which is the Kids in the Screen study. This is a 2-week-long media diary that's conducted with children aged 2 to 12 years old, 2,000 of them at 2 points in the year. And this really provided us with that context around exactly how kids view in the sort of the complete picture, cross-platform and cross-device. We then also ran a more tailored bespoke study, which specifically focused on the audiences of most interest to ITV and CITV, so looking at 6 to 11-year-olds and their parents. And then we did a qualitative deep dive. So this incorporated a 3-day-long online community with families and also some depth interviews to follow up. And finally, we did some semiotic and cultural analysis around the shows that we'd identified that were coming out as real winners to dig a little deeper. So within this presentation, we're going to be focusing on specifically the qualitative and semiotic stages of this study.
So as we all know, content is getting harder and harder to cut through, not just for all adults, but kids as well, particularly kids, as they tend to be early adopters. As you can see from this chart, free online video websites and paid for on-demand services are just on the up, and kids are finding different ways of watching content. So we wanted to find a way to how we could cut through. So we, in a big world of content with a huge array of content offerings from different platforms, we really wanted to know how we cut through quickly. So we thought about using semiotics as a methodology, as it just lends itself well to this problem, to this question. We, as you know, the advertising world and the film world use codes all the time in order to cut through and get messages across to potential customers or viewers instantly. So we thought we'd apply coding, and we called it triggers. because we just felt that it is literally a trigger that really gets somebody to do something quickly. So we cut it as we know. You know anything from audio to tone to costumes to the talent that's in something to the title. All these things subconsciously quickly ignite a connection with people. They make us listen, they make us look, they make us feel like it's something for us. They resonate with us and they evoke excitement and intrigue. And that nostalgia, familiarity can sometimes be the thing that just you see it and think that's definitely something for me. So we wanted to apply this to kids' content. So we wanted to split it into 3 areas. The first one was implicit triggers. So what are the things that cut through instantly? So kids instantly feel that it's something for them. The second thing was content triggers. And this was when they're in the content, when we've got them in, how do we get them coming back? What is it we need in our content that makes them feel that they want to come back to see more? And the third thing was their expectations. So in this cluttered, massive world of content, what are they watching on other platforms, whether it be Instagram or YouTube, that have changed their expectations? And how can we embed those expectations into our content? So alongside this, we're doing this study amongst adults. So this is brilliant to have. We wanted to extend it to have it across kids as well, so that we create a framework of success that can transcend audiences wherever possible.
Great. So what we'll do now is we'll kick off by really looking at what underpins kids' favourite content. So what we identified was that kids' content choices are structured by these 2 core tensions. And the first is looking at this aspirational versus relatable content. And the second is this kid-centred versus adult-centred content. So in terms of aspirational, this is content which is driven by winning and striving for success. We're calling this wind-up content. It's quite high octane and it gets kids excited. It's often centred around an overarching threat, so this idea of sort of good versus evil, and it doesn't tend to be grounded in kids' everyday lives, so it's outside of the norm. On the flip side of this, we have relatable content. So this is often driven by humour, so being able to laugh at yourself and be silly. It's slower paced, so what we're calling wind down content. And it's centred around some sort of social or domestic conflict. That could be rivaling siblings, for instance. And this content tends to be grounded in kids' lived realities. So it's more a part of their normal lives and seeing them reflected back at themselves. Then on the other side, we have this kid-centred versus adult-centred content. So for kid-centred, unsurprisingly, this is where kids are the stars. It's driven by their own concerns, and it tends to elevate and celebrate the voices and achievements of kids themselves. And this will be the content that kids tend to watch more often on their own or with a sibling. In terms of adult-centred content, this is the opposite. So this is where adults are often the stars, it's driven by adult concerns, and it elevates and celebrates their voices and achievements. And this is the content which is most frequently watched together as a family. So what we've done is we've been able to actually plot some of the most popular shows that were identified through the quantitative stages, but also shows that are particularly relevant to ITV and the CITV channel, into this quadrant. And what you can see is there's certain shows which are plotted between kid-centred and aspirational, between kid-centred and relatable, adult-centred and relatable content, and then adult-centred and aspirational content too. And what we've been able to do through plotting these shows across these core tensions that we've identified is to group this type of content into 4 different clusters. So in the top left-hand side of the quadrant, you can see that we have our empowered content. In the bottom left-hand side, we have our everyday content. In the bottom right-hand side, we're calling this the unconventional content. And then in the top right-hand side, we have our ambition content. So let's have a look at these different clusters then and how they actually fulfill different needs. So if we think about empowered content, this is fundamentally content which is where they're saying, I want to be just like them. It empowers and inspires kids' imaginations, and it makes them feel strong and powerful themselves. And this is often the type of content that we see them reenacting and role-playing with their friends. Everyday content, so this is content where it's they're like me. It's grounded in kids' worlds, it's reflecting their own lives back at them, and it's really important actually for kids to see this content where they can see themselves reflected back. Then there is the unconventional content, and this is content which is nothing like them at all, so very different to the everyday. These are shows which actually allow kids to revel in everything that's a little bit silly, and it really helps them to escape their own thoughts and feelings. Finally, we have the ambition content. So this is all about when I grow up, I want to be like this. So it showcases the glamorous world of adult lives, and it's often about kids dreaming about being something different. So maybe a famous pop star or a footballer, for instance. And what we see is that kids tend to shift between these different content clusters across the day to suit their needs. So in the morning, empowered content has a particularly important role to play. This is all about feeling powerful, it's about winding them up, getting them excited for the day ahead. And then when they come home from school, we see that they really start tapping into this everyday content, so content where they can actually relax, and it's content that they can relate to. But we also see that when they're viewing with their siblings, they tap into this unconventional content. So it's all about escaping from the school day and hanging out with their brothers or sisters. Ambition content really comes in the early evening time, and we know this is particularly prevalent during the weekends. And this is that content which is all about actually being with the wider family, sitting down and watching a show together, which has this element of entertainment and competition. And then finally, before going to sleep, they revert back to what they know best and what they love, which is the everyday unconventional content. So it's all about comfort watches before bed that they're very familiar with. So there we've identified the type of content which exists and why it's so popular. But now we want to understand a little bit more about what keeps them coming back and what keeps them engaged with these different types of shows and content. So what we can see is that each content cluster has a unique set of viewing triggers, and Fiona alluded to some of these at the start. So we have these implicit triggers, content triggers, and expectation triggers. And for the implicit triggers, this is all about what makes kids initially decide to choose that content. So why do they actually pick it out in the first place? For the content triggers, this is all about what keeps kids coming back and keeps them engaged. And the expectation is all about what they expect to see and what they're seeking out for themselves to really fulfill their own needs. So when we look at implicit triggers, we'll be thinking about things like visual language and design, title and title sequences, and music, language, and audio. When we're looking at content triggers, we're thinking about characters and presenters, the narrative and the story arcs, and also any audience involvement and interaction. And then for expectation, this is about content that suits their needs. So do they want to wind up? Do they want to wind down? Is it about viewing on their own or viewing with the family as well? So what we'll do is we'll take you through each of the different clusters that we've identified and look at some of these triggers that sit behind them. So first of all, we'll talk about empowered content. So remember, this is in the top left-hand side of the quadrant. So here we're thinking about triggers surrounded around power, progression, and tension. So when it comes to power, we can see that there are visuals such as graphics and imagery that will be associated with power. So there might be lightning bolts or electricity, for instance. And the characters will often have special powers that they will showcase through the show. In terms of progression, so this will have cinematography, often dynamic camera movement, so zooming in and zooming out quite quickly. And these will have longer running storylines, and often one episode will feed into the next and there'll be a cliffhanger at the end. And then in terms of tension, there's often language focused around different types of conflict, and there'll be this underlying struggle between good versus evil. And we know that this content is all about satisfying that need, about content just for them, and about winding up. Key examples of empowered content are Jurassic World, Lego Ninjago, and also Spy Ninjas. If we think about everyday content then, and some of the triggers that sit behind this, we know that for everyday, this is the bottom left-hand side of the quadrant that we were talking about. And this is all about family, feelings, and familiarity, but importantly with a twist. So in terms of family, these shows are often set within the family home as the core base, and they'll have quite a normative family setup. So there'll often be a mum, a dad, and a brother and sister, for instance. In terms of feelings, they'll often have catchphrases focused around expressing emotion. If you know Horrid Henry, you'll recognise this from just the title sequence. And the narrative is often centred around some kind of conflict or solving of different family feelings. Again, using Horrid Henry as an example, there's a lot of sibling rivalry that's included there. Then for familiarity, what we see is that the animation and design, whilst it's quite normative in terms of the family setup, the design won't be super realistic. So there might be half-drawn lines, for instance. And the world that they live in for everyday content will be very much grounded in kids' lived realities and will be reflecting themselves back at them. So we know this content is all about winding down, and it's all about content which is for kids. Good examples of everyday content. So you've got The Simpsons. Obviously, there's the normative family setup there, but they look quite different. You've got Loud House, and you've got Horrid Henry too. Okay, now let's move on to unconventional content. So this is the content cluster that sits in the bottom right-hand side of the quadrant. And here we're talking about triggers surrounded by unusual, surreal, and timeless. So when it comes to the unusual, this is where we see a use of music that is very different to other types of shows. So there might be jazz incorporated, for instance. The characters tend to be defined as a little bit different and going against conventions of society. So not that normative family setup that we saw with the everyday. And then in terms of surreal, it will be a neighbourhood, but with a twist. So there might be a pineapple house that they live in, for example. And the narrative, in a similar way, will be quite normal experiences, but then all of a sudden will become very surreal and extreme. So, for instance, going out shopping, and then there'll be a zombie apocalypse. And then in terms of timeless, it's often re-established reincarnations of existing brands that we see, and the use of retro designs and motifs. And different again to the everyday is that episodes won't necessarily feed into one another. They can exist in isolation. And what we know about this type of content is that it's wind down and it tends to be more for the entire family. Good examples of unconventional content, we can see Mr. Bean, Scooby-Doo, and Rabbids Invasion. So the final content cluster then is the ambition content cluster, and this sits in the top right-hand side of the quadrant. Now this is centred around glamour, talent, and communality. So glamour is all about using visuals where we've got gold, we've got glitter, and we've got lots of sparkle. And these shows are often set in a space associated with performance, so a theatre, for example. In terms of talent, what we'll see is the titles will often actually reference the skills and the use of the word talent. So Britain's Got Talent, for instance, Strictly Come Dancing, The Masked Singer. And the characters and contestants, they'll actually have something that sets them apart, a skill or a talent which makes them a little bit different. When it comes to communality, often these shows will refer directly to the audience and draw them in. So speaking to the UK or to the audience and getting them involved by inviting them to actually be judges themselves. And what we see about this content is that it's all about fulfilling a need to wind up and get excited, and it's content that satisfies the entire family. Good examples of ambition content are Strictly Come Dancing, The Masked Singer, but importantly as well, football games can be really good examples of ambition content. So there we've taken you through the different content clusters that we've identified by analysing popular shows among kids and families. And then we looked at the triggers that sit behind those in terms of why they start to view and why they continue viewing. So what does this all mean? Well, we know, as Fiona said at the start, that kids' media ecosystems are very fragmented, and this has actually only been accelerated since the pandemic. So we know that they can view across multiple platforms and multiple devices, and they can view in many different ways. But what we also know is that the reasons why they're viewing is because it's all about the content they love. Content really is king. So understanding what sits behind this favoured content and hero shows has never been more important. And what we've identified is these 4 different clusters across the empowered, ambition, everyday and unconventional. And really what we can see is that if you can own a viewing moment rather than just one of these viewing clusters, then what you'll do is you'll really embed yourself into kids' daily routines. So for instance, owning those wind down moments. But what we also see, and we haven't had time to look at within this presentation, is that content that really grabs kids' attention tends to combine triggers from both the everyday and the empowered content cluster. So it's content which they love, which they're very familiar with, and which they can kind of come back from school and relax to, but it also has elements of excitement that can really wind them up too.
And this has really, really helped us at ITV. As Maxine said, borrowing triggers from each of the clusters and putting them into another cluster that wouldn't normally be there just makes content feel fresh and new again. So this has really helped us with CITV. We now have lots and lots of triggers that we can use as stimulus, but also for main channel. So borrowing a trigger from Empowered and throwing it into Ambition for a Saturday night programme for us is really, really useful in terms of coming up with new ideas for a Saturday night show, for example. So while attracting children is really, really important to us, family viewing is also incredibly important to ITV. Bringing that family together and bringing the nation together is in ITV's DNA. And for us new ways for us to do that is always what we're looking for. So this research has been hugely useful for workshops going forward.
So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And if you do have any questions or would like to know any more information, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with either myself or Fiona. So thank you.
Thank you.